Section 1 of the Black Cat, Volume 4, Number 3, December 1898. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Claire. The Black Cat, Volume 4, Number 3, December 1898. Section 1, The Glen Echo Mystery by Walter Wellman. 6 months ago, through the death of a kinsman in Chicago, a lot of old pictures, furniture, bric-a-brac, and papers came into my possession. Most of these things were stored away in the garret of my house. One day, having occasion to go to the storeroom, my attention was attracted to an old-fashioned, battered leather trunk. I had often thought of satisfying my curiosity as to its contents, but had never been able to find a key that would fit the lock. This day, however, it occurred to me that the ancient leather contrivance was of no value, and that a knife would do quite as well as a key. So I whipped out my pocket-knife and ripped a long slit in the leather top. Within I found a large number of packets of old letters, account books and diaries, and all sorts of manuscripts and pamphlets. All these I tumbled out upon the floor and looked through them in an idle way. At first I found nothing of unusual interest. But soon I came upon a packet of peculiar shape. It was apparently a sort of homemade envelope composed of 2 pieces of old-fashioned blue linen, paper folded and glued together. Upon the face of the packet was inscribed these words: "Strictly private. Never to be opened by anyone but me, Henry Stone." This was the signature of my dead kinsman, and I suppose I should have respected his injunction, but I did not. My curiosity was stronger than my reverence for the dead, so I slit open the packet. Now I wish I had not done so. By prying into the secrets of the past, accidentally placed within my keeping, I have come face to face with a mystery which appalls me. For days and days and nights I have turned it over in my mind, have looked at it from every point of view, have analyzed, searched, thought, imagined, but it has been all in vain. I am completely baffled. So are my friends to whom I have submitted the matter. Our combined ingenuity fails to afford a solution. What I found within the packet of old blue linen paper was simply the following 3 cuttings from newspapers of long ago. Mysterious disappearance at Glen Echo. Poughkeepsie, October 20. The police officials here and detectives from New York are unable to throw any light upon the mysterious disappearance of Sylvester Baldwin from the house of our esteemed fellow townsman, Professor Edwin Stone, who lives in the old stone manor house at Glen Echo, one of the picturesque suburbs of the city. Mr. Baldwin strangely disappeared last Sunday night, and though diligent search has been made for him during the 48 hours that have elapsed, not a single clue has been obtained. Mr. Baldwin's home is in Boston. He came here about 2 weeks ago to visit Professor Stone, who was his classmate at Harvard. A house party was given in his honor, and among the guests were Mr. and Mrs. George Jones of Albany, Miss Irene Davidge of New York, and Mr. and Mrs. Wilson of Yonkers. Mr. Baldwin was about 25 years of age and a rising young lawyer of Boston. He was unmarried, but it is whispered that he had become engaged since his arrival here. Mr. Baldwin was in fine health and spirits. Almost every day the guest had indulged in picnics, boating excursions, fishing, horseback riding, and other amusements. Mr. Baldwin was the life of the party with his vivacity, wit, and love of fun. On many of these excursions it was impossible for Professor Stone to go, as it is well known that in his laboratory, located on the roof of the manor house, he is carrying on some very important experiments. When he felt compelled to remain in his workshop, Professor Stone designated Mr. Baldwin to act as his representative in the entertainment of the party. Sunday last, the ladies and gentlemen, accompanied by Professor Stone's aged mother, with whom he lives, attended divine services in the morning and spent the afternoon in walks and drives. Toward evening, the weather growing colder, they all assembled in the big dining hall, where they made a rousing log fire in the old-fashioned fireplace. They had refreshments and music, and Mr. Baldwin's fine baritone voice was never heard to better advantage. About 10 o'clock, after planning their excursion for the next day, all retired to their rooms on the 2nd floor. Mr. Baldwin was heard by Mr. and Mrs. Jones and by Miss Davidge, who occupied adjoining rooms, to enter his chamber a few moments after they had reached their own apartments. He was whistling softly or humming an air, indicating the happy condition of his mind. He was also heard closing a window and closing and latching the outside blinds. Between the apartment of Mr. Baldwin and that occupied by Mr. and Mrs. Jones there is a door somewhat warped by time, and through the cracks and the big old-fashioned keyhole Mr. Jones heard Mr. Baldwin bounce into bed, but as the light in his room was not extinguished, as Mr. Jones noticed when he put out his own light and retired, the supposition is that Mr. Baldwin was reading in bed before going to sleep, as was his habit. From that moment, not the slightest trace of the young lawyer has been secured. The last known of him, he was apparently lying in bed, reading, a happy man. Next morning he was not in his room. All his clothing and effects, save only the pajamas which he wore as a night robe, were in the apartment. He had disappeared as completely as if the earth had swallowed him up. It is inconceivable that Mr. Baldwin suffered an attack of mental aberration and wandered away, for there had been a light fall of snow that evening, and no tracks were found in it around the house. The barn and outbuildings, as well as every nook and cranny of the manor house, were carefully searched. The police looked into the haymows and even lowered a man into the wells. They scoured the country around, but no one had seen or heard of a man wandering about in his pajamas. If Mr. Baldwin left the house, he went away without shoes, hat, or clothing, and as cold weather has prevailed since his disappearance, it is almost inconceivable that he has not been forced to apply for shelter or food during the last 48 hours. The detectives do not believe that Mr. Baldwin left the house. The morning after his disappearance, the window blinds in his room were all found fastened on the inside. So, too, were the front door and the rear or kitchen door and side door of the house. All were locked with the keys in place inside. The detectives have satisfied themselves that the fall of snow Sunday evening ceased about 9 o'clock, and it would have been impossible for Mr. Baldwin to wander away or to be carried away without leaving traces of footsteps. But neither Mr. Baldwin living nor Mr. Baldwin dead is to be found in the house now. The search has been thorough from cellar to garret. Professor Stone's laboratory upon the roof has been thoroughly ransacked. As is known to our citizens, Professor Stone is engaged in investigations looking toward a new illuminating process and also in the waterproofing of fabrics. For these purposes, he keeps upon the roof quite a collection of apparatus, retorts, gas generators, a large lot of fabric, some of which has been chemically treated, tools, fine instruments, etc. Professor Stone says he was in his laboratory hard at work the night his friend disappeared. No other mention of the family or any of the guests heard Mr. Baldwin's steps that fateful night. Professor Stone insisted that the detectives should thoroughly search his laboratory. The officers opened the gas machines, sifted the cinders and all the retorts, and overhauled all the piles of fabric. They found not the slightest trace of the missing man, dead or alive. Professor Stone and all the members of his house party, so merry a few days ago, are bowed down with grief. They not only fear that Mr. Baldwin is dead, but they are overwhelmed by the mystery which surrounds them. They feel that they are living within the shadow of a tragedy which has not been explained, and which thus far is wholly inexplicable. Mystery piled on mystery. Poughkeepsie, October 22nd. The mystery of the disappearance of Sylvester Baldwin is not yet cleared up. In fact, it grows deeper and darker. This morning, a telegram was received from Saratoga. It reads as follows. Chief of Police, Poughkeepsie. Body of man in night clothes found last Monday morning at daylight by mail carrier on Bridle Path in the Adirondacks, about 100 miles from here. What was date of your man's disappearance? City Marshal. To this, Chief of Police Kipley replied, giving the date of Mr. Baldwin's disappearance and adding, impossible same man. Of course, it is impossible, and yet it is a most strange and striking coincidence. Have two men disappeared in their pajamas during the past week? This most extraordinary development did not impress Chief Kipley as having any bearing upon the Baldwin case. When asked if there could possibly be any connection between the two incidents, he replied, quote, It is absurd to think there was. Mr. Baldwin disappeared after 10 o'clock Sunday night. Early next morning, the body of a man was found in the Adirondacks 200 miles from here. There is no railway nearer than Saratoga. It is a journey of about 2 days from the place where the body was found to the nearest railway station, and that is by mounted courier. A wagon would need 4 days over those rough roads. It was a physical impossibility for the body of Mr. Baldwin to be carried to that remote point in the Adirondacks by next morning, and therefore we do not need to discuss this phase of the case any farther. The body found in the mountains is that of some other man. End quote. Chief Kipley is undoubtedly right. Your reporter has ascertained that the only train for the north after Mr. Baldwin retired to his room was the Midnight Express, which does not make connections at Albany for Saratoga. The earliest possible arrival at Saratoga would have been at 10 o'clock Monday morning, and that is still 100 miles by a rough mountain road from the place where the body was found, according to the telegram at daylight Monday morning. Notwithstanding the utter impossibility of there being any connection between the two incidents, Miss Davidge, who has taken much to heart the strange fate of Mr. Baldwin, has insisted that careful investigation be made of the Adirondack case. In this, she is supported by Professor Stone and by others at the Glen Echo house. Their anxiety is so great that they grasp at straws. Chief Kipley, to humor their strange whim, has agreed to send a man to the mountains to inquire carefully into the finding of the body there, though protesting that it is useless expense and trouble. Chief Kipley is still convinced, as are all the detectives who have worked on the case, that Mr. Baldwin, living or dead, is still in the manor house. He has expressed his belief to Professor Stone, and the latter has insisted upon a more thorough search. In consequence, the old house has been nearly pulled to pieces. Partitions have been cut down, floors ripped out, walls opened, the floor of the cellar dug up, and the ashes and cinders in every furnace and stove, including the retorts in Professor Stone's laboratory, have been subjected to chemical analysis by Professor Tausig and Brunner of the Polytechnic School. The barns and outbuildings, straw stacks and wells have all been researched. Every scrap of paper in Mr. Baldwin's rooms has been scrutinized. All the inmates of the house have been subjected to another examination, but without disclosing any new facts. Not a single trace of Mr. Baldwin or of the manner in which he left or was taken from his room, not even a shadow of a clue, has been discovered. Mr. Baldwin's body found. An astounding case. Saratoga, October 26. The body found in the Adirondacks a week ago this morning was that of Sylvester Baldwin, after all. It has been positively identified by Professor Stone, Mr. and Mrs. Jones, and Miss Irene Davidge, who came here to view it, accompanied by your reporter. But instead of clearing up the mystery, this discovery has darkened it into one of the most inexplicable crimes of the century. All we know now is that Mr. Baldwin is dead, that he disappeared from his room in the manor house at Glen Echo after 10 o'clock Sunday night, the 8th instant, that his body was found at daylight next morning 200 miles away, 100 miles from the nearest railway, and that he must have been foully murdered. Detective Brown, who was sent by Chief Kipley to investigate the Adirondack case, reached Saratoga last Friday morning, and by hard riding over the mountain roads, arrived at Cascadeville Saturday evening. There he found the body, which had been brought in from a point 8 miles north. Mr. Brown closely questioned the mail carrier who had found the body about 6 o'clock Monday morning on his way from Lake Placid. There was no doubt as to the day and hour, as these were attested by the mail carrier, Daniel Givens, and by the authorities at Cascadeville, who had sent after the remains and also dispatched a courier to Westport with a telegram to the city marshal of Saratoga. When Givens came upon the body, it was lying in the road. His horse was frightened by it. The remains lay in a sort of heap and were not yet quite cold. The skull was smashed, the neck broken, and the head driven in toward the shoulders. Many bones in the body and limbs were broken, indicating that the remains may have been tightly packed in a box or crammed into a cask. The only clothing upon the corpse was a suit of silken pajamas, tied round the waist with a cord of the same material. The deceased had never been seen in that region, nor was anyone known to be missing. The population is sparse, and every tourist and sportsman is known along the trails to the guides, boatmen, and innkeepers. No man could carry a human body to that remote a spot save upon the back of a horse, and no mysterious horseman or other person was reported from any part of the district. The manner in which the body had made its appearance in the midst of the mountains was as much of a mystery to the people there as the means by which it had been removed from Poughkeepsie was to Detective Brown. Detective Brown had known Mr. Baldwin, and as soon as he saw the body, he was convinced of its identity. Accordingly, he sent a courier with a telegram to Chief Kipley and hired 2 men and 2 horses to help him carry the remains to Saratoga. They arrived here at 3 o'clock this afternoon, and there was a sad scene when our party from Poughkeepsie were admitted to the undertaker's rooms to view the body. Everyone at once recognized in the broken and mangled mass of flesh handsome, manly Sylvester Baldwin. Professor Stone was greatly agitated when he beheld the features of his college chum and his best friend, and Miss Davidge uttered a cry of pain and would have swooned had not Mrs. Jones led her away. The face of the deceased is natural. In one of the front teeth is a gold filling, just such as Mr. Baldwin had in one of his front teeth. The silken pajamas are precisely like Mr. Baldwin's, and moreover his initials S.B. are embroidered upon a little linen tag under the neck. The name of the maker, a Boston firm, is there too. Still stronger proof of the identity of the remains, if any were needed, is found in the fact that in a pocket of the pajamas was discovered a locket containing a miniature of Miss Irene Davidge. There is, therefore, not the slightest doubt whatever that this is the body of Sylvester Baldwin. There can be no doubt either that he was murdered. But how and by whom? And above all, how was his body carried in 6 or 7 hours, some 200 miles from his room in the manor house at Glen Echo to that lonely spot in the mountains, to reach which a journey of 2 days and nights is required even under the most favorable circumstances? It cannot be possible that the body which we have here is that of another man. It is beyond reason to suppose that there was a simultaneous disappearance of 2 men, both wearing silken pajamas exactly alike, the 2 men resembling one another in figure, face, color of eyes and hair, teeth, and everything as closely as if they were twins, both bearing the initials S.B., and both carrying in their pockets a miniature of Miss Irene Davidge of New York. Every one is greatly depressed, not only on account of Mr. Baldwin's sad fate, but by the inexplicable mystery surrounding the dreadful tragedy. The police and the detectives are without even a theory. The doctors and professors who have carefully examined the body and subjected parts of its raiment to microscopic tests are without any explanation, however shadowy and unsatisfactory. Have the black arts been revived, or must we ascribe this most extraordinary tragedy to the working of some modern miracle? This is a strange story my curiosity had unearthed from the recesses of my dead kinsman's trunk. You will now see why I am sorry I disobeyed the injunction which I found written upon the blue packet. The tale which these old newspaper clippings tell has rung in my ears and whirled about in my brain, robbing me of sleep and making me nervous and restless. I have searched the old trunk again and again for further light upon it, but without success. I have had a feeling that somehow or other I must discover the dread secret, for this tragedy was in my family. Not only did it occur, or at least have its beginning, in the house of one of my kinsmen, but now that the circumstances have been brought so strikingly to my attention, I recall that my relation, Professor Stone, married the Miss Davidge who figures in the story, lived with her in happiness for many years, and reared a fine family of boys and girls. Though I had never known either Professor Stone or his wife, Mr. Henry Stone, their brother, who left to my charge the fateful trunk, has told me of the professor's successful and useful career and happy home life. But all my efforts have been unavailing. I am unable to find a clue or even to evolve a satisfactory theory. I can only give my readers the facts and leave them to struggle with the problem as I have struggled. Postscript. The foregoing was written some months ago. Meanwhile, I have made strenuous efforts to throw off the strange fascination which this mystery has exerted upon me, to stop thinking and worrying about it, but to no purpose. It has continued to harass me. Today, feeling more desperate than usual, I went up to the garret with a hatchet and a big knife, determined to cut the old trunk to pieces in order to discover if its shell contained any clue to the mystery. Underneath the lining in the bottom I found a letter apparently no more than 5 or 6 years old, which reads as follows. San Francisco, June 20, 1892. My dear brother Henry, I am writing this letter to you with my own hand despite my physical weakness. It is the last letter I shall ever write to you, for I know my end is fast approaching. The doctor tells me I shall recover, but he cannot deceive me. I have, as you know, led a busy, a useful, a successful life. My inventions have brought me distinction and reward. There is only one thing in my career which I regret, and even that does not fill me with much remorse. Once there came to me a moment in which all that life seemed to promise me, all happiness, success, and ambition, were involved in a struggle for mastery between 2 men, myself and another. It is the law of nature that when 2 forces come into collision, the weaker must give way. Nature has thus established the principle of the survival of the fittest, the dominance of the superior over the inferior. It matters not whether the struggle comes between planets or molecules, men or animals, nations or tribes, the law is the same. No man can be above the law of his being and his surroundings. It is his right and duty to work out his salvation within the sphere and under the principles which nature has ordained. And yet, in my case, that which I had to do was extremely disagreeable. I had to remove a man from my pathway. One or the other had to suffer a most grievous loss, a fatal disappointment, and when this clash of interests came, I had the right, under nature's laws, to defend myself. The man whose life crossed mine and whom it was necessary for me to remove was my best friend, and for the moment my guest. These circumstances added to the unpleasantness of my task, but did not deprive me of my right of self-preservation, a right which exists in every living thing, from the humblest to the highest, and whose exercise nature restricts only with limitations of power. You may wonder, brother, why I write these words. I write them because it is not in my nature to die with my secret untold. All these years I have carried it alone, absolutely alone. An impulse which I can neither describe nor control leads me to share my secret with just one human soul, and of course he can be none but you, my dearest friend and brother, who has shared all his secrets with me. You will recall all the circumstances of the tragedy which happened at our house in Glen Echo shortly after I left college and while you were in Europe. We have often talked them over in the past, and you, like everyone else, tried to solve the mystery. If you had only known what I knew. I loved Irene Davidge before Sylvester Baldwin did. Before he and she met at our house, I was passionately devoted to her. I made up the house party for the purpose of providing a good opportunity to press my suit, which I knew was not unpleasing. Before she returned home, I had confidently expected she would be my promised wife. But from the first day she met Baldwin, I knew my star was setting and his was in the ascendant. He was rapid and prosperous in his love-making, and I was forgotten. In a week they were lovers. One day I saw him kiss her as they stood behind some rose bushes in the garden. Had I not been a philosopher, a man of cool, calm reasoning, I should have killed him there and then. But you know my self-possession, my absolute control of self, my favorite theory that he who can master himself can master the world. All that night I reasoned it out with myself. My conclusions, which to me then, as now, appeared logical, were as follows. 1. Without her, my life is ruined, as I know myself well enough to know I shall never love again. 2. If he lives, she will be his, and I, the superior man in all save those superficial qualities which attract the other sex, shall be the loser in life's battle. 3. Nature has ordained that the superior shall triumph, and therefore I have the right to remove him from my way. 4. If I do remove him in proper fashion, she will be mine, as she would have been mine had he not come between us. Therefore, his removal will give me that which I must have. Conclusion. I will remove him. Action being determined upon, it only remained to decide the means. It was necessary that everything should be done in a prudent and orderly way. There must be no danger of discovery or even of suspicion being fastened upon me, for of course that would defeat the purpose in view. To obviate the possibility of pain or humiliation to our dear mother, or to you, my brother, was as much my duty as to protect the mind of Miss Davidge from being poisoned against me. Therefore, it was necessary to proceed only after thorough consideration of all the possibilities. A minor point, but still one worthy of attention, was that I should not be compelled to do any actual butchering with my own hands, nor have any gruesome scenes about me. Even in this supreme moment, when I was successfully to work out my destiny or utterly ruin myself, I could not overlook the fact that I was a gentleman, nor could I take the risk of employing a confederate. In a few hours my plans were laid. I hope you will agree with me that they were laid with judgment, skill, and thoroughness, as become a man of science and self-possession. Fortunately, I had in my laboratory all the materials needed for my operations, but there was much work to do. Day and night I toiled up there on the roof of the old house where you and I afterward passed so many happy hours while perfecting my inventions. I absented myself as much as possible from the house party, in part because I could not endure seeing him and her together, and in part because I needed all the time for my preparations. During a period of 100 hours, I took only as much sleep as one ordinarily gets in 24. At last I was ready. I remember that it was Sunday noon, just after services, that I tested my work, reviewed all my calculations, and found that nothing had been neglected. After dinner in the evening, I spent some time with the party in the dining room, and the loving glances exchanged between Sylvester and Irene were more endurable to me than they had hitherto been. Excusing myself about 9 o'clock, I went upstairs. Entering Baldwin's room, I struck a match and found the book which he was engaged in reading. It was Horace's Odes, from my library. I knew Sylvester's habit of reading for an hour before going to sleep. He formed it in college. Opening the volume to the bookmark, I turned over 6 pages and inserted there this note which I had prepared. Dear Sylvester, if you are not too sleepy when you find this, come up to the laboratory. I have something important to show you. E.S. I calculated that it would take him a quarter of an hour to read from his bookmark to my note, and I felt sure he would come, as he had displayed much interest in my experiments, and had complained because of late I had admitted him so rarely to the laboratory. My only fear was that in the time which I had given him, not all of the other people in the house would be asleep, as I naturally did not want anyone to know he had visited me. At the same time, I dared not place the note farther on in the book, lest he should not reach it before falling asleep himself. Of course, I could have deferred the removal till another night, but now wind and weather favored, and I courted no delays. He came a few moments before 11 o'clock. I was ready for him. Sylvester, said I, here is a machine I have built for experimental purposes, and I want you to help me test it. All right, Edwin, he replied. What is it now? "A new gas holder made of silk," said I, "and here is some of the new gas. Take a good whiff of it. It is like wine in the nostrils." He took the metal flask, which I handed him, turned the cock, and in a moment or two fell insensible at my feet. I had filled the flask with a combination of chloroform and hydrogen under pressure, and when the cock was turned, a cloud of most powerful anesthetic fumes burst into his face. Now I was master of the situation. First, I locked the door leading to the floor below. I noted with satisfaction that he had brought my note with him, thus saving me a perilous trip down to his room after it. I burned it in my furnace. A look at the anemometer showed a wind movement of 30 miles an hour, and I was glad to see that the barometer was still falling. If it had been possible for a man of my temperament to have faltered in a set purpose, the sight of the locket containing Irene's portrait, which had fallen from the breast pocket of his pajamas as he fell, would have served to nerve me for my task. With your knowledge of my thoroughgoing methods, dear brother, you will easily imagine how carefully I had planned everything. Sylvester's exact weight I had ascertained by a casual inquiry a few days before to be 153 pounds. I assumed that he would come to me without stopping to dress, for he was hardy and athletic and proud of his ability to endure exposure, an important point on account of the nicety of my calculations. The weight of the gas bag was 18 pounds, and of its lines and netting 5 pounds, total 176 pounds. By careful test, I had found the weight of my gas, it was nearly pure dry hydrogen, was 80 thousandths of an ounce per cubic foot, and as air weighs 1 2/10 ounces per foot, I had a net power of fully 1 1/10 ounces per foot. The gas bag was spherical and a little more than 18 feet in diameter, giving it a capacity of 3,150 cubic feet, equal to 217 pounds lifting force. It was necessary to have a little margin to compensate for loss of gas by leakage. Careful calculations of the rarity of the atmosphere at various altitudes showed me the bag with the burden would at first ascend to a height of about 5,600 feet, where there would be an exact counterbalance of the weight of air displaced and the weight of the apparatus and its burden. Then it would slowly descend as the gas escaped from the bag. It was, of course, desirable that it should at first ascend to a great altitude, as that would prevent its being seen by anyone who might be astir. It was quite as desirable that the whole machine should remain in the air at least 6 hours, that it might be carried a proper distance away. At the same time, it must drop its burden before daylight, before anyone could see it and perchance understand its dread significance. It was highly important, too, from my viewpoint, that the body should be found sooner or later and be unmistakably identified. Otherwise, Irene might take it into her pretty head to do the romantic by waiting year after year for the possible reappearance in life of her absent lover, which would be decidedly unpleasant for me. Hence, I did not dare to arrange to send the apparatus out to sea, as I might easily have done. For the same reason, I replaced in the pocket of Sylvester's pajamas the locket with Irene's miniature in it which had fallen from it. It was absolutely necessary that the apparatus and its burden should not be found together, for in that case it would be easy to trace the two to a common source, to wit, my laboratory, thus defeating the purpose in view. To obviate this danger, I had made careful experiments in the effect of various acids upon fibers, and was able accurately to determine the time in which a given quantity of diluted vitriolic acid would eat away a cord of given strength so that it would part under the strain of a weight of 156 pounds. By this means, I made sure that the apparatus and its burden should be separated before daylight, the latter to fall to earth, and the former, relieved of its incubus, to ascend to the skies and fly perhaps 1,000 miles before coming down. Such a cord, twisted with acid and timed to sustain the load just 6 hours, I tied about the waist of Sylvester and made fast to the netting underneath the gas bag. The moment had come. Carefully I looked all about from the roof to see that no one was watching my operations, and noted with satisfaction that the night was extremely dark and in all respects favorable to my purpose. At 11:15 o'clock Sunday evening, October 18, I took Sylvester's living right hand in mine and pressed it with a farewell greeting. Then, with the 3 rapid slashes of my knife, I cut the guy ropes and my little balloon, with the body of my rival dangling beneath it, darted upward and northward into the gale. Your affectionate brother, Edwin Stone. Such was the secret of Sylvester Baldwin's death. Was it to be expected that anything less than the diabolical craft and ingenuity that brought it to pass should penetrate its mystery? End of section 1.
Section 2 of The Black Cat, Volume 4, Number 3, December 1898. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Julie Burks. The Black Cat, Volume 4, Number 3, December 1898. Section 2, Bumblepuppy on the Range by Edward Boltwood. A feeling of desperation pervaded the home ranch of the 3X outfit in South Dakota, although it was the time of the gathering of the hands for the beef roundup, which was regarded as a mere pleasure excursion up and down the Belle Fourche in the cool days of September. The usual festal occasion seemed to be darkened by the shadow of a great grief. The boys were depressed. They sulked at mealtimes. They did not tell stories at night. It wasn't because they were underpaid, although this was undoubtedly true. The reason, as Shorty Garr expressed it, was that they were locoed by the Britisher. Mr. Horace Peedy, Q.C., the managing director of the Scotch Syndicate, which owned the 3X, was making his first inspection of the property. Mr. Peedy had examined the company's lands in South Africa and intended to make a clean job of it by looking over the American ranch also. His coming had been awaited by his hosts with much anticipatory pleasure, but his actual arrival had been followed by bewilderment and a stinging sense of defeat, and John Heffron, Shorty Garr, and the bookkeeper talked it over one evening while they smoked their pipes on the cookhouse steps. "As the old man said," remarked Mr. Heffron, "before this Petey hit the ranch, 'tain't no harm,' says he, 'to make him think he struck a hot crowd. His letters is full of yarns and advice from South Africa, and I'm sick of 'em. Bring around your bucking broncs,' says the old man, 'and pack your guns, and we'll make him think this here western country,' says he, 'is a darn sight wilder than any South Africa on the map. Make it warm for him,' says he, 'and he'll say we sure ought to be paid big for living in such a tough place.' And I put it to you, Tompkins, ain't we done our best?" The bookkeeper nodded. "Best?" inquired Garr disconsolately. "I'll bet we have. The first turn out of the box was when I caught up Hot Biscuit for this East Squire to ride down to the hay camp. Now, Biscuit ain't what you'd call bad, just loony. So I leads the pony around to the office, and there was Petey dressed up in tight white pants and shiny boots like he was going to walk the slack wire. He spots me looking at his rig, and he says, 'This is the way we ride in Pretory.' I don't know anything about Pretory, but men have been shot for less in the Badlands. So he gets on the horse and puts his toes in the stirrups and leans over Biscuit's neck like he had a pain in his inside. Biscuit, she slides down a mud bank and turns head over heels, not knowing what to make of the heft on her shoulders. 'My word,' says Petey, wiping the gumbo out of his eyes, 'do you ride these brutes every day?' 'Sure,' I says, 'thing to get a raise of pay without showing cards. 'By Jove,' he says, 'it's lucky that wasn't a South African pony. When horses over there throw a man, they try to eat him up.' I went behind the corral, and I says to myself—" "Never mind what you said," interrupted the bookkeeper judiciously. "Why didn't you make a play with a 45? "Listen to me," said Heffron. "I was loping down the creek with this English feller day before yesterday. I'd heard the boys claim nobody could get a start out of him, and I thinks, John, you are the man for this job, even if you do have to make him smell powder. We came along through Sandy Bottom, him and me, where the box elders is thick and the trail narrower. All of a sudden, I begin to look fierce and cuss and spy into the underbrush like I see something bad. Then I pulls the gun and pumps 6 shells at the trees, swearing and tearing and leathering my horse. We ran our ponies up to the rise, and then he said, 'Let's go back and skin 'em.' 'Skin who?' says I. 'Those rabbits,' said he. 'Rabbits,' says I. 'Them was the Powder River gang, and they're on the kill.' 'Well,' says he, 'let's go back and skin them. They do that sort of thing most every day in South Africa.' And I couldn't say a dumb word." Garr resumed the mournful tale. "We gave him a meal," said Shorty, "over to the horse camp. Raw onions and bacon sliced lengthwise, all fat. He said that was the kind of grub they saved for sick hands in the Welt or some such place. Now I ask you, Tompkins, how can we turn the hair of a Comanche like him?" "Poker," said the bookkeeper. "He says," Heffron replied with the hopeless air of weariness, that the only cards he ever plays is whist, and at home he has followed that game every night for 20 years. "Oh, that kind, is he?" said Tompkins meditatively. "Well, we'll give him a whirl." It happened that Mr. Petey was decidedly that kind. Whist was his religion, Cavendish his Bible, and his club knew no more constant devotee of the silent game. That night 4 men sat around a card table in the office: Mr. Petey, Q.C., John Heffron, Tompkins, and Joe Robinson, the foreman. A pair of gaudily painted lamps illuminated the cozy room. Pipes and cigars were in full blast, and a bottle and glasses were placed in hospitable proximity to the players. Everything foreshadowed an enjoyable evening, but the deliberate solemnity of the Americans would betray to anyone but a stranger the existence of a momentous plot. "Who'd expect," said the Englishman, "to have a quiet rubber on a cattle ranch? By Jove, it's luxurious, it's effeminate. In South Africa the wild devils are not beyond checkers." 53, announced Tompkins, thumping down the last of a pack of cards. "All set. Heffron, it's you and I against 'em." Mr. Petey lifted his eyebrows in incredulous inquiry. 53, said he. "Is that right? For whist?" "Certainly," Tompkins replied without blushing. 52 and the joker. It's your deal, Mr. Petey." "What are we playing for?" growled Robinson. "The same old thing?" "Sure," said Heffron, laying a revolver on the table. "What do you suppose? Soap?" "Well, I wanted to know beforehand," Robinson replied, sticking an unsheathed bowie in his belt, "so's I wouldn't be caught afoot when the cattle is running." These manifestations did not escape the Londoner, and he looked furtively at his partner. Tompkins was critically inspecting the edge of an axe which he had finally laid on the floor under his chair, and the deal was hastily finished. "Look here, you know," said Mr. Petey, "there's a card left over." "That's the trump," said Robinson. "Where did you learn this game?" Mr. Petey gasped, and Tompkins led the king of diamonds. The foreman promptly played a spade. "No diamonds, partner?" asked Petey, in the most silky and approved across-the-table voice. "Yes," Robinson answered in apparent surprise. "A few." "But you didn't play one, you know." "Well," interposed Tompkins, contemplating the handle of his axe, "it's his own hand. Let him play it." "Perhaps you don't understand the great American improvements in this game," said Robinson politely. "You see, you don't have to follow suit unless you want to." "And all ties go to the kitty," volunteered Heffron, slapping down the joker and pulling in a trick. "It makes a pretty game," Robinson added. "You'll like it." Like it? The unhappy clubman could not have been tortured more effectively by the rack of the Inquisition. He was like a devoted monk, forced to be present at the desecration of a cathedral by a horde of barbarians. The politeness of a guest, backed by the impressive exhibition of weapons, stifled his protests, but the Chancellor of England could not have felt so outraged if he had been tied to his wool sack and compelled to witness a game of tag in the House of Lords. It was not even Bumblepuppy. It was like a game from Alice in Wonderland. When Robinson claimed that Big Casino outranked the ace, Mr. Petey writhed in silent anguish. When Heffron, at the end of a hand, proceeded to add the points on the cards to see who had game, Mr. Petey's horrified eyes blinked rapidly with emotion. But when Tompkins told him that it was the leader's privilege to play 2 cards at once in order to guard against emergencies, Mr. Petey staggered to his feet and gesticulated violently. "Gentlemen," he cried, "I have been in rough places before. I have been in the hardest land among the hardest people in the world. I refer to South Africa." Heffron groaned. "But," continued Petey, "never have I seen such barbarities as I have witnessed tonight, and by the Lord Harry, I hope I never will again. Men who do such things will do anything, by George. This country may be all right to make money in, but it's not fit to live in. Mr. Robinson, by Jove, sir, you'll find my bag packed in the morning." Far into the night the conspirators celebrated the sagacity of the bookkeeper. Good enough to play whist with Petey is now the highest compliment which can be paid a card player at the 3X. End of section 2.
Section 3 of The Black Cat, Volume 4, Number 3, December 1898. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Sabrina Pyun. The Black Cat, Volume 4, Number 3, December 1898. Section 3. The Transformation of Mrs. Dwight's Son-in-Law by Louise S. Todd. The window was open a little at the bottom, and the warm spring breeze blew fitfully in upon the occupant of the low rocking chair. It was one of those late April days when the buds show in tiny green spots on the blackened tree branches, when the grass begins to look fresh despite the brown patches which occur at intervals, as though to prove that the brightness is only premature after all, and that summer is still far away. One of those days when the warm air steals into one's veins and stirs all the youthfulness there, even that left in decrepit old age, filling one with something of former fervor and a desire to accomplish seemingly impossible ends, when the middle-aged fancy themselves young once more and start forward gaily to do battle with the world, with the reflection of youth's vigor, only to discover that middle age, after all, holds them in chains and refuses to release them from bondage. Something of these feelings, without the inevitable conclusion of despair, for as yet she had not put her youthful powers to the test, vibrated through Mrs. Dwight as she swayed to and fro in the low chair by the open window. Her lap was occupied by a pile of men's socks, one of which she held in her hand while her eyes busied themselves in watching the precision with which her fingers wove the thread through and through until the whole was filled with a beautiful, intact piece of embroidery. But her thoughts, impelled by the stirring of youth within her, had strayed to the past. Not the far-off past, she never thought of that, but to the past which was the reason of her sitting there darning leisurely at a pile of men's socks. Directly opposite Mrs. Dwight, on a low table, and where, if she raised her eyes for a moment, she could surely see it, stood a large photograph in a silver frame with doors. The doors stood open. The portrait, as one reason, the other was the owner of the socks. The picture was that of a girl, perhaps 17, with a purely oval face, framed in fair, wavy hair, with great dark eyes which looked at the gazer with a certain wistfulness almost pathetic, were it not contradicted by a sweet, tender mouth which seemed about to smile and which suggested a dimple in hiding at the corner. A very fair reason, this one, and she had been Mrs. Dwight's daughter. It had all happened 10 years before, and the bright, beautiful story had ended as suddenly as it began. Ah, that beginning, with lovely, enchanting, spell-weaving Venice for a setting. Venice in spring, how soon to be shadowed by gloomy, cold, dark New York. New York submerged in a rainy winter. And that was all, but the exquisite happiness of a young life lay between. Mrs. Dwight and her daughter had been traveling for nearly 5 years, finding that their scanty income was more satisfactorily utilized that way than in trying to live at home. There, in that Venetian spring, Mrs. Dwight had encountered a man from home, a man she had met many years before during her husband's lifetime, who remembered her, and with our usual American affinity became her cavalier forthwith. She had liked him. If she had not, she would quickly have snubbed him in her quiet, ladylike way. As it was, she permitted him to come and see them frequently and make a third to their party on their little jaunts. She never thought of him in any light save that of a kind compatriot, a man of her own age who had been successful in his business and was using some of the results of that success to see the world. The awakening came when he asked her to give him her daughter, her Virginia. "I do not ask you to give her up," he had said in his pleasant way when he saw the quick pallor in her face. "I only ask you to take me in, to let me be your son-in-law." And then he had smiled a little at the absurdity of it. He, who had traveled life's path a year farther than she, asking to be regarded as her son-in-law. She had accepted him as such when she found that Virginia had given her heart to him with all the intense fervor of a child whose circle of loved ones has been limited. Virginia's mother sometimes wondered, even yet, if it had been more than a child's affection, if it was what the man demanded. Then came a blissful 2 months of travel, when Mrs. Dwight found how pleasant it is to have someone to look after you and take charge of everything, for Mr. Winthrop had accompanied them and insisted upon being their courier. In the fall they had come home, and Mr. Winthrop had urged an early marriage, to which the mother could find no reasonable objection. "My house is lonely," he had said to her. "I want my wife very much." And then he had smiled so wistfully at her that she was forced to give way, inasmuch she was to benefit by the change too, and have a home once more. So the wedding was fixed for January. But in December, hardly a month before the wedding, Virginia Dwight died. Oh, the bitterness of it all! They had been obliged to take her away from the apartment where they had secured rooms. In spite of Mr. Winthrop's urgency, Mrs. Dwight would not take Virginia to his house, and there had remained only the hospital. After Virginia's death, Mr. Winthrop had come to her again, and she was too weak then to combat his arguments. So when he said he was lonely as she, and that together they must learn to bear their sorrow, she agreed to come and take charge of his house. If she had not been so overcome by her grief, she might have stopped to ask what the world would think, but she did not care about it then, and to her surprise, had she been capable of any such feeling, this was one time when the world said nothing. It seemed the natural thing to do. She had assumed in their eyes the position of Mr. Winthrop's mother. But on her arrival in Mr. Winthrop's house, she covered her soft, dark hair with a little lace cap. She was thinking over some of this past while the warm spring air blew in upon her, and her busy fingers continued to weave the threads into the hole in the work in her hands, when from the hallway came the sound of approaching footsteps and the rustle of silken garments. She put her work into the basket and the basket under the table near her, then she stood up to greet her visitor. The rustle came through the door and filled the room as a tall woman swept gracefully forward, clad in all the attractive beauty of a new spring costume. "How do you, Mrs. Dwight?" she said in the sweetly penetrating tones cultivated by a society woman. "I knew you wouldn't mind my coming right up." "I am very well, thank you," replied the other, quietly ignoring the last remark. "How pretty you are looking," she added after a moment, but she spoke as though it were an admission she would rather not feel justified in making. The younger woman, who was perhaps 25 or 6, flushed a little and looked over her shoulder towards the door. "Thank you," she said. Mrs. Dwight knew her better than any woman in New York, perhaps, for Marian Maybrook had made a point of calling on her very soon after Mr. Winthrop had taken up society again. Even now, he did not go out so much as before Virginia had come into his life, yet he was in great demand, for he was still in his prime. A man is never more eligible than when he is in his early 40s and has made a tolerable fortune. Besides, Mr. Winthrop had such pleasant, deferential ways with women that they all liked him. Virginia's mother did not go out, but she had returned Miss Maybrook's call, and Marian had taken that for an evidence of her liking, and come frequently ever since. Mrs. Dwight could not have told whether she liked Marian or not. She rather fancied not, since she had heard the rumor that Marian Maybrook had the inside track with Clarence Winthrop. She had credited this feeling of resentment to a natural protest against anyone's taking Virginia's place, and if the younger woman ever noticed any coolness in her manner, she never showed it, but came as often and was just as agreeable. This afternoon she rattled on in her usual go-aheadative way, talking of everything that was going on in the outside world, giving little bits of gossip, but through it all hovering around herself as a topic of conversation, as though there were something pleasant to be told concerning her. Marian had a bright way of telling things, which seemed to suit the key she used to talk in, and Mrs. Dwight, listening with a quiet, interested smile, found her very entertaining and wondered if others did too. If men did. There was a restlessness apparent in Marian's manner which was puzzling, and several times she saw her eyes wander to the picture of Virginia with what she fancied was a pitying curiosity. Finally, she spoke of the house, of its old-fashioned beauty, of the harmony of its decorations, the exquisiteness of the wood-carving, and as she talked, her eyes were fixed with something like pity on the older woman, whose cheeks flushed. The call seemed to drag endlessly. Marian stayed only an hour, but it seemed 3 or 4 before she stood up nervously and said with a quick, indrawn breath, "Won't you call me Marian just once, and kiss me as my own mother might?" She had put her hands on Mrs. Dwight's shoulders. She was a little taller of the two, and she looked down at her with the same pitying look. Then she stooped suddenly and kissed her cheek with a passionate eagerness. Her own mother was dead, and she lived alone with her father. When she stood up again, there were bright tears in her eyes, but her mouth was stern. "Hasn't Clarence Winthrop told you of the intended change in his life?" she asked. Then, seeing the bewildered look in her companion's face, she stooped again as though to kiss her. Mrs. Dwight drew back coldly. "Mr. Winthrop tells me whatever it is necessary for me to know," she said icily. "You are going now? Good afternoon, Miss Maybrook." "Yes, I must go. I have an engagement," Marian said hurriedly, a faint flush creeping up her cheek. "Goodbye, Mrs. Dwight." And with another look at Virginia's picture, she left the room. Mrs. Dwight stood quite still until she heard the door close behind Marian in the lower hall. Then she threw open all the windows, letting in the fresh spring air. It had grown a little cooler, and the air had lost its tinge of warmth. She took up Virginia's picture, and leaning close to the window, looked into the dear eyes long and lovingly. The air blew coolingly on the pictured face as well as the living one. The loving scrutiny had lasted several minutes, when she put the photograph back on the table and shut the doors with a quick, passionate gesture. There was a mirror above the fireplace, and she walked over to it, looking at herself with a frown. "I am not old," she said to herself at last. "I feel too young. I will not be old." The white lace caught the light and gleamed snowily. It was the work of an instant to take it off and pull the soft, wavy hair underneath into something like order. "I am younger now," she whispered half aloud. It was not merely the spring atmosphere. It was really there all the time inside me, and this hideous cap made me forget it. "Virginia," she added, "I know you will forgive me that your mother must reassert her age here in this house where she came as your husband's mother. But there is another woman now, and I am going to be alone again." Perhaps there was also a thought to which she did not give utterance, but which flushed her cheeks and made her turn away from the mirror. At least she was standing between 2 of the windows a few moments later when a man came in, and the draught was fanning the loosened hair against her heated cheeks, while the late rays of the afternoon sun shone caressingly on her head. "Marian has been here, she tells me," the man said, yawning lazily as he came towards her. He was good-looking, though his hair was beginning to turn gray on the temples, and his mustache and beard were tinged in the same way. He was one of the many who make true the affirmation that New York is noted for its fine-looking middle-aged men. The flush still remained on Mrs. Dwight's cheek, and she felt it burn deeper at this confirmation of her thought concerning Marian's engagement. "Yes, Marian has been here," she said. Something in her tone made him look at her more sharply, and he saw her flushed cheeks, her tossed hair, and her little cap crushed in her hand. "What has Marian been saying to you?" he asked, half smiling. Mrs. Dwight steadied her voice with difficulty. "She tells me you intend making some change in your method of living." Mr. Winthrop frowned angrily and muttered something under his breath before he answered. "I do expect to," he said. "Pray, do not hesitate about telling me, Clarence," she returned, trying to control herself. "I still have something to live on, you know, and can leave you at any time when you find your other arrangements. I can go in a moment, you know. But I don't see why it is necessary for you to leave me at all. Everything can go on just as it does now, with, of course, this difference." "Certainly not," Mrs. Dwight interrupted. "I should not stay to be an encumbrance." "I don't mean you to stay. I want to ask you to go." "I have said I would go, have I not?" she interrupted again. Mr. Winthrop looked at her in amazement. She, who was usually so calm and serene, who waited until he had said what he had to say and then discussed it with him quietly, she now interrupted him, speaking quickly and with evident excitement. In his astonishment, he looked around the room curiously, as though to discover the cause of the change. He saw the windows were wide open. He noted the work basket upset as she hurried through the room to open the windows, the balls of cotton and a white china egg or two tumbling unheeded on the floor. Then his gaze came back to the figure before him. The serenity had depended on the little lace cap, perhaps, and she had thrown them both aside together. He wondered vaguely if she had thrown the former away forever, or if she had crushed it for the time as she had the flimsy bit of lace in her hand. "Did Marian tell you what the change actually was?" he asked at last, watching her intently. She shook her head. "Then I must tell you myself," he continued. "We have been having trouble with our Chicago agent, and it has become necessary for one of the firm to go out there and look after affairs in person. As I am the least tied down here, the lot has fallen to me. That is what I am going to do." Mrs. Dwight drew a sigh of relief. Until now, she had not realized what it meant to her had he told her what she expected. He heard the sigh. "What did you think Marian meant?" he asked. She did not answer, but she drooped her head until her eyes were fastened on the carpet. "Won't you tell me what you thought, Gertrude?" He tried to call her Mémé, Virginia's pet name for her, and one which he had always used, but that seemed not to belong to the woman who stood before him now. It seemed to have been cast away with her serenity and her cap. Mrs. Dwight tried to raise her head, tried to look at him, and speak with her old placid calm, but his gentle Gertrude disarmed her, and she only could murmur almost incoherently, "I thought she meant you were going to be married." Her voice trailed off in an inaudible whisper. Mr. Winthrop heard, however, and his face grew deadly pale as he walked over to the window and stood looking out. The air which blew in was much colder now, and he shivered a little. Perhaps that was the reason of his putting out his hand to steady himself. It touched the silver frame on the table and lingered there, the fingers closing over it. Then he seemed to feel it and look down. He saw the doors were closed. Virginia's mother had raised her head, but her eyes were still downcast when Mr. Winthrop spoke to her. "I am going to be married," he said. "If the woman I want will have me." She raised her eyes and looked at him half startled. "I think she will," she said in a low voice. "I do not know," he said in the same way. "Will you?" "I?" Her voice broke. "I thought you cared for Marian. I am sure she does for you." "No," he said. "I know she cares for you, and I asked her to come here often, as I thought she would entertain you. I find her interesting, don't you? But I don't want Marian. I want you, Gertrude. Will you go out to Chicago with me as my wife?" "I would, yes," she said frankly, her serene, loving eyes fixed on his. "But for Virginia—" The man's fingers loosed their hold on the silver frame. "Virginia belongs to the past, Gertrude. Such a sweet, beautiful past. You and I have our future before us, and though the life we have lived here has suited these last 10 years and New York, it will not do for the rest of our lives and Chicago. I cannot live without you, Gertrude, and from now I shall love Virginia as my daughter, since she was yours. I cannot live without you. That has overcome many arguments, and she had not many to overcome. She was so alone with only the picture of Virginia, and he needed her even as she needed him. But before he came around the table to her, they opened the doors of the silver frame. The windows were closed when Marian Maybrook came back a half-hour later, and Mrs. Dwight was sitting alone in the low rocking chair, mending another hole. This mending had been the happiest thing in the past, the one thing she had done exclusively for him, and it belonged to her future too. The nervousness was still apparent in Marian's manner when she came in, but she forgot it in a little outburst of pleasure. "How pretty your hair is," she said. "And you have covered it all these years." Then she knelt down beside the older woman, after a quick glance at the picture on the table, and spoke hurriedly. "I came to tell you something this afternoon, and then my courage gave out. I am engaged to be married. Don't you remember my telling you about Jack Glenshaw? You know it began in Venice, and I hated somehow to tell you because your daughter— Dear Mrs. Dwight, I have no one to be glad with me." Marian's head with its pretty new spring hat was pressed against her companion's shoulder. The older woman dropped her mending and patted the younger's shoulder tenderly. There were tears in her eyes and in her voice, as well as a great love and pity in her heart for the girl at her side. She did not hesitate about her emotion now. "My dear," she said very tenderly, "it would only have made you nearer and dearer to me. It would have seemed as though you were taking Virginia's place. Oh, my dear." Marian had thrown her arms around Mrs. Dwight's neck and was kissing her passionately. "Everyone has been so nice about it," she whispered, "but no one has looked at me as you have done." In a moment or two, she stood up and looked again at the picture on the table. "May I?" she said. But without waiting for a reply, she had kissed the pictured, smiling lips. "I think I should have loved her," she explained, "but I never dared to speak of her to you." As she put the picture back on the table, Mr. Winthrop came in. "Have you told Marian?" he asked. Then, as Mrs. Dwight shook her head, flushing a little, he added, "Marian, will you come to a quiet wedding tomorrow noon at St. Mary's? You may not see us again, as we are going south for a few days and then to Chicago. By the way, how did you know I was going out there?" Marian smiled a little, and the color came up into her cheeks. "Jack told me," she said. "He heard it out there." "Oh, Jack is here too, isn't he? I forgot I saw you with him a few hours ago. Perhaps you had better bring him with you tomorrow." Marian kissed Mrs. Dwight very tenderly as she said goodbye, adding, "I shall see you some day in Chicago." But before she left the house, she came back and called from the doorway, with happy tears sounding through her ringing tones. "I am so glad about you two dear people. I always knew you were intended for each other and was so afraid you would never find it out." She saw they were standing in the light from the western window, and that Clarence Winthrop's arm lay across Mrs. Dwight's shoulders. But neither she nor they noticed that the wistfully smiling picture of Virginia had fallen face downwards on the table. End of section 3.
Section 4 of The Black Cat, Volume 4, Number 3, December 1898. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Felicia Molyneux. The Black Cat, Volume 4, Number 3, December 1898. Section 4, The Man from Alaska, by Louis Weslyn Jones. Poor little Monsieur Francois. He leaned against the short counter in the front part of his little restaurant and allowed his tearful gaze to wander out into the street over the boiled crabs, juicy beefsteak, and wine bottles which adorned his show window. One thing was certain, he thought to himself, that if he would continue as proprietor of the Louis d'Or French eating house, assuredly something must be done immediately towards improving business. But what could he do without capital with which to back his operations? Mechanically, he opened the cash drawer and peeped in. What he saw couldn't have offered much encouragement, for he closed it quickly and, with a deep sigh, once more gazed out into the street. After all, he thought, what was the use of longer continuing the everlasting struggle of success? Here he was, with the same little restaurant, in the same little side street, offering to the public the same excellent cooking as when he first started the business 15 years before. And yet, how different everything was now. Many other restaurants had sprung up in the neighborhood, and alas, there wasn't enough trade to go round. Sapristi! San Francisco is filled with eating houses, groaned the little Frenchman. And so many poor, cheap affairs, too. My old customers have deserted me. What care Americans for good cooking? The American atmosphere affects even my own countrymen, who also pass me by. Bah! They think me old-fashioned. They believe me not fin de siècle. Had I but $1,000, what couldn't I do? I would make the Louis d'Or so attractive that no one could resist. But alas, I've nothing. Nothing. Unless trade improves, I must surely close up in another week. I fear that I must ask Pierre and Jean to wait a few more days for their wages. Poor, honest fellows. They are the only ones who have stuck by me. And mine host had hard work to keep back those glistening, rebellious tears. Just then, a cab was driven up alongside the curbstone directly in front of the restaurant. Surely it won't stop here, thought Francois. But it did stop there, and a big giant of a fellow clambered out of it, with a great deal of unnecessary noise, and, handing the driver a $5 gold piece, dismissed him and his vehicle. Then the big man, who was dressed in a rough but well-fitting suit of brown Scotch cloth, opened the door of the Louis d'Or and stepped inside. He drew a large gold watch from his pocket and noted the time as he inquired in a stentorian voice that admirably suited the rest of his general makeup. 5 o'clock. Am I too early for dinner à la carte? Francois answered no, that although Monsieur was the first guest of the evening, his dinner should certainly not be delayed, nor in any way inferior on that account. Good! Shouted the big man, seating himself at the large table in the middle of the room. If you're ready, why then, by George, I am too. Bring on your menu. Pierre at once appeared with the bill of fare. Faithful Pierre! He was the only waiter left now. But then, as Francois had argued, such a modest little restaurant with such a very slender patronage didn't require more than one waiter. The big stranger's large blue eyes swept the cardboard at a glance. Then he stroked his luxurious brown beard and bellowed enthusiastically. Who says there's another such place in all Frisco as the Louis d'Or? Damn your bespangled and bemirrored cafes, I say. Give me good eating in a tiny shop like this, where you pay your honest money for honest cooking and honest wines, and not for a lot of devilish claptrap rubbish. Francois's face showed uncertainty. Was this big chap drunk, or fooling, or really sincere? The guest seemed to read his host's thoughts, for he added immediately, Oh, I mean just what I say. I'm not one of your confounded joshers, and I'm not under the influence either. To tell the plain, unvarnished truth, I've had nothing to eat and nothing to drink for 26 hours. I've been preparing for this feast, I can tell you. Francois's face showed worriment. Could the big chap pay for his dinner? Had he any money, that he had starved so long? Again were his thoughts apparently read by the first guest of the evening, who went on to say, "Don't you be afraid for an instant that I'm unable to settle my bill. Why, dang it all, man, I'll not only pay, but I'll pay better than you were ever paid in your life before." And he whacked a bulging leathern wallet down on the table with such force that the water bottle was almost upset. "And now, waiter," he continued, "bring on the soup." "What kind of soup, sir?" asked the interested Pierre. "All kinds," replied the big man. "Very well, sir." And Pierre went about his duty with a puzzled expression on his brow, while Monsieur Francois pinched his leg under the counter to make sure of his wakefulness. While Pierre was gone, the stranger improved the time by carefully studying the bill of fare and marking with a blue pencil the dishes that especially appealed to him. When the waiter returned, he brought with him an immense tray containing 6 dishes of soup of various kinds, which he proceeded to arrange in a semicircle on the table before the big man. "Ah!" exclaimed the latter gentleman, "this is what I call bully!" And he sampled each soup in turn, beginning at the right-hand side and taking them in rotation. "Now, when they are ready, bring on the fish." "What kind of fish, sir?" "All kinds." Pierre's eyes sought his master's, but he could gain no additional intelligence from the stupid look on Francois's countenance. "Very well, sir," mechanically said Pierre, and started off. "And the wine, too," called the guest. "What kind, sir?" Pierre stopped to inquire from the doorway. "All kinds," was the hearty reply, and Pierre disappeared with a reverential bow. The stout gentleman appeared to be delighted with the soups, and was not at all backward in expressing his satisfaction. "This consomme is grand," he declared, nodding approvingly at Francois. "And so are these other 3. But when it comes to downright Epicurean excellence, I'm thinking, by George, that it's a standoff between the tomato bisque and the mock turtle." And he fell to with renewed vigor, and did justice to each one of the 6. Then Pierre reappeared with his immense tray, loaded down with boiled salmon, fried flounder, broiled bone smelts, and other palate ticklers from the sea, which soon were being devoured by the hungry guest with many manifestations of pleasure. "Don't forget the wines," he managed to say between mouthfuls, as the waiter vanished with the empty soup dishes. The wines were soon at hand, pint bottles of fine old claret, Burgundy and Riesling, and the big man finished all of them, together with most of the fish, while Francois and Pierre looked on with growing interest and wonder. "And now," cried the banqueter, with undaunted enthusiasm, "let's have everything that I've marked with blue pencil." And he tossed the cardboard to the waiter. "And by the way, have you any extra dry champagne? Well, bring me a 6 bottles. The finest you have." There's no use going further into details regarding that dinner. Let it be sufficient to say that no human being, before or since, ever consumed a greater amount of food and drink at one sitting than did that lone guest at the Louis d'Or. To remark that Francois and Pierre were amazed is to say too little. They were appalled, paralyzed, for in all their experience, they had seen nothing like it. Francois made up his mind that, at all events, the big chap must and should be humored. Pierre couldn't even make up his mind. It was beyond him. While the stranger was finishing his dessert, a few old customers dropped into the restaurant for their usual evening meal, and the waiter was compelled to divide his attention and services between them and the stout gentleman. When the newcomers observed the numerous empty dishes and wine bottles on the table in front of the lone banqueter, they all stopped to gaze in astonishment at such an unusual spectacle. Oblivious of all the excitement he was causing, That gentleman finished his black coffee and cognac with a flourish, and then, rising noisily to his feet, announced in a loud voice that he was through. "All except," he added with emphasis, "the toast. My friends, pardon me for interrupting you at this very beginning of your dinner, but I have 3 bottles of champagne left. The best, by the way, that ever warmed the heart. And I want you all to join me in drinking the toast." The newcomers all signified their willingness to partake of the wine at the expense of the liberal gentleman, and Pierre was ordered to fill all the glasses. "Yours also, mine host," called out the banqueter, with a low bow to Francois. "And yours too, waiter." And so both proprietor and servant joined the party with well-filled bumpers, in spite of Francois's protest that it was a very unusual proceeding. "By George!" suddenly shouted the stout man. "I nearly forgot the cook. Oh, say, let's have the cook by all means." And the wondering Jean was brought forth into the world from the mysteries of his kitchen amid general applause, and was given a large goblet of sparkling champagne. "And now, my friends," continued the big man, his good-natured face all aglow, "allow me to explain the origin of the toast which we are about to drink. Just a year ago this month, a poor, proud devil, who had failed in business, came here to Frisco, without a penny in his pocket. For 3 long, dreary days he walked the streets of this town, seeking employment, without a bite of food to eat. On the evening of the 3rd day, he found a 10-cent piece in the gutter. He was so devilish hungry that he must have been a little out of his head, for, strange as it seems, he felt nothing on earth would satisfy his outraged appetite but raw oysters. Oh, I know it sounds funny, but just wait till you are dying of that terrible sickness, starvation, and then see how it affects you. No 2 men alike, I swear. Well, gentlemen, this unhappy chap went from restaurant to restaurant, in a dazed sort of way, trying to get 10 cents worth of oysters with salt and pepper and lemon on 'em. But in every place he was laughed at and sneered at and was turned away, until he happened into a tiny French cook shop in a little side street, where they served him a few oysters as if they were buying a dozen, with salt and pepper and lemon too, by George. And in one of those oyster shells that starving man found a large pearl. He didn't realize what it was at first, and when a jeweler in Montgomery Street gave him $300 for it, the shock nearly killed him. The forlorn stranger's good luck dated from his visit to that little French eating house. He met an old acquaintance that very night, who was bound for the Alaska gold fields, and the 2 of them made the trip together, and struck it rich. I was that starving man, gentlemen, and this was the restaurant where I got my oysters. And, gentlemen, since I arrived in San Francisco 26 hours ago, I've touched neither food nor drink, in order that I might banquet here this evening in a manner befitting the occasion. And I might add that even ordinarily I have the appetite of an ox. I've just finished the grandest feast ever set before man, gentlemen, and I've made out my own bill, which amounts to exactly $2,060, with $100 each to waiter and cook as tips. And there's cash. With this, the big man laid a great roll of crisp bank bills on the table. "Don't interrupt," he cried as Francois tried hard to speak. "Every dollar of it is due you. And now, gentlemen, up with your glasses." Every glass was held on high. "Here's to the Louis d'Or and its proprietor," roared the big fellow. "May their success increase with each new day." And every glass was drained. "Ah, there's my cab now," the banqueter exclaimed. Before anyone could collect his scattered wits, the man from Alaska was out of the door, which, however, was opened immediately while the big brown head was thrust inside. "Oh, I say, gentlemen," called out the departing guest, There are some of my cards. And he tossed a bunch of business pasteboards into the room. I'm to be married at the Occidental Hotel next Wednesday morning, and I want all of you to come. If you don't, and he winked threateningly at Francois, why, damn it all, I'll come back and eat you out of house and home. End of section 4.
Section 5 of The Black Cat, Volume 4, Number 3, December 1898. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Greg Giordano. The Black Cat, Volume 4, Number 3, December 1898. Section 5. 2 Christmas Eves by Wilson S. Henry. Number 1. The Overland Express had just roared past Granite in its western flight, and number 17, the fast freight, was reported 4 hours late, so the agent had 4 hours of Christmas Eve to himself. There was a glowing, soft coal fire in the whitewashed stove in his snug little office, which threw out welcome heat. The light of a kerosene lamp was subdued by an ornate paper shade, upon which some Louis XV sort of people were doing a gay dance on a green lawn. The agent at Granite was a tall, good-looking young fellow, with a smooth face that, just now, was so bright that it had to be shaded like the lamp, with a soft felt hat. Observant people, who glanced at the Granite depot out of car windows as the train rushed past, usually said, "What a dreary life!" or wittily asked each other how anyone could exist in such a spot, 1,000 miles from nowhere. Now the fact is that instead of being 1,000 miles from nowhere, Granite was just 6 miles from everywhere, the place at which all of us try to locate some time or other. The everywhere of this poor devil of an agent was the ranch of one Thompson, and the girl who made it everywhere was Thompson's daughter. She had made it somewhere to him for a long time, and very gently but surely had it come to be everywhere. They had taken many long rides and walks over the prairie that gently undulated away from them with but little topographical interruption for hundreds of miles in every direction. His love for her had grown to accord with this vast expanse of landscape until it filled all the vista, from the hills that narrowed into a canyon in the east to the far high mountains in the west. And so, because it was a great, vigorous, outdoor love, he had found it hard to tell her of it by word of mouth, though he has often felt that just a little word would do it all, so nearly did her thoughts seem to run with his, and so knowing were her dark eyes. This Christmas Eve he told her all about it on paper. With an absurd idea of doing justice to the thing, he filled both sides of 10 sheets, the railway company's own private paper, and then, in despair, he put it all into 3 lines. He finally compromised on 2 pages of what was really, from a literary standpoint, an admirable specimen of condensation. It was to be sent out with some Christmas gifts brought out for him from Cheyenne by the obliging conductor of number 8. For her mother there was a Scotch plaid shawl of florid design. For her father there was an elegantly bound morocco volume of 500 gilt-edged leaves entitled The Horse, His Diseases, with a spirited gilt horse, remarkably free from disease, cavorting upon the cover. For her there was a hand-painted satin Christmas card. It bore a winter scene that sparkled beautifully with imitation snow. Under it was a pretty verse, so warm with love that it would have melted anything more like snow than diamond dust. The packages were wrapped up and the letter duly addressed. As he sat waiting for Thompson's man, Whitaker, who had promised to look in after finishing his business at Fleener's store, he gave freedom to his fancy, which threw love lights ahead and showed him that golden future we all dream of, and which always cheats us by dribbling along, one poor little day at a time, instead of coming all at once, as we promise ourselves it will. From the confused rattling of the telegraph key, his ear suddenly caught the letters GN, 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 his call. He took the following message. Rock Creek, Idaho, December 24. P.J. Thompson, granite. East drift, cut, or pipe, below fault yesterday. Breast in solid, horned silver. Assays 41 to 6400. Old Chute Shore, Warner. As he sent back the OK, Whitaker and Fleener came in. He arose excitedly with the message in his hand. Say, he said, they've struck it in the old man's claim, found the old vein. Look here, $4,000 a ton. How's that for a little Christmas present? The hell you say, exclaimed Whitaker fervently. Well, I want to tell you right here that I never worked for a whiter man than old Thompson. Must be hundreds and thousands there. Holy smoke, what a strike! More'n likely it'll pitch out 'fore they gittin 6 foot, said Fleener. Yes, and more'n likely they got $50 million there, asking to be shot down and heisted out. He's a dead square man, too. I'll take that telegraph out in a hurry. You got some other stuff to go? He queried of Andrews. Be quick with it. Why, yes, here, no, nothing else at all. Well, so long. I'll skin out with this. It'll paralyze him. Probably ain't nothing but a blamed pocket, said Fleener. It ain't no trick to find good prospects. What's the matter, under the weather? Ain't feelin' well, eh? Guess I'll go over to the store, tell the boys about it. For a moment Andrew stood still, trying to determine just what calamity had befallen him. He took the 3 packages and placed them on a table in his little bedroom off the office. He took the letter in both hands, as if to tear it across, but hesitated. Then he put it away in the bedroom with the painted satin Christmas card. It was worthless now, like the currency of a conquered nation, but it had once been legal tender for a fortune of dreams. A little later an operator in the chief dispatcher's office at Cheyenne said, Granite must be getting a Christmas jag on. He broke 4 times, taking that order for 17. 3 days later at the station, Thompson said to Andrews, Well, we're going to get out of this God-forsaken place at last. Going to travel a while, and then we'll settle in a civilized country where we can have first-class advantages. There's that daughter of mine has grown up here on the desert and never seen anything. I'm going to take her where she can see the proper sort of people and live right among 'em. I think she will lead a very happy life, said Andrew. Well, it won't be my fault if she doesn't. We got money now, and she can trot with the best of 'em. There was much confusion around the depot the day the Thompsons left. All of Granite was there to see them off, and 20 people can make quite a stir. Martha was sprightly and vivacious, and her pretty, tanned face was rich in color. Goodbye, you, she said, and she clasped his hand tightly and tried to look into his eyes. Goodbye, Martha, he said. I hope you will. Whatever it was he hoped, he didn't say it distinctly. It seemed to be something commonplace enough, though. There was a last pressure from her warm little fingers, and she was in the car. As the train started, she looked out at him with wistful eyes, but his gaze was centered upon an imaginary point 1,000 miles or so beyond the farthest mountain peak. For this reason, she secluded herself and cried for 50 miles. All through the long days after they had gone, he had ample time to think over his loss. while he really felt it to be irreparable, he still possessed that magnificent delusion, hope, which was always reiterating a lot of nonsense to him. In the hot summer days, when the sun blistered the little red wooden building, and every green thing died under its heat, his love was only seasoned by it. And when winter came again, and dressed the earth in swan's down, and snowy, spangled tights for its Christmas pantomime, the biting blasts only made his love more hardy. His hope was really not impractical. It comprised simply the sudden loss of P.J. Thompson's entire fortune through unwise speculation, complete failure of the mine in which he still retained an interest, in the immediate return of the family, in comparative poverty, to Granite. That would bring her back, his own little Martha of the old days, with her plain dresses and pretty ways, her deep eyes, her soft brown hair, and her little hands that could hide so easily in his. He felt that if she should come back that way, he could tell her of his love. Then there would come days when those foolish hopes that lure lovers from reason would fail him, and he would grow low-spirited and morose. At such times Fleener would come across the track from the store and cheer him up. "'Tain't money as makes people easy in this here world," he would remark sententiously. "I know folks with thousands of dollars, and ain't really any better off'n I be." Mr. Fleener's time was chiefly occupied in sitting in front of his store and meditating cynically. Mrs. Fleener boarded the section men. "Now just take that Thompson girl for example," he said one day. "She'll probably get married to a damned prince or a duke or some of that riffraff. That's what American girls with money does these times. And they get led a dog's life, too. The titles and glory, striped uniforms and helmets is what catches 'em every time. My wife's third cousin, Blivens by name, Homer J. Blivens, made a pile of money on a patent right. Then his girl up and married a furrin nobleman right away. They're living in a kind of stone palace in India, with whole passels of people to wait on 'em, wearing special clothes for it." There was no good reason to doubt the truth of this narrative, except the fact that Mr. Fleener was a notorious liar. Toward the end of the second year after the Thompsons' departure, Mr. Fleener sauntered into the office one day. "Ain't heard the news yet, eh?" he asked Andrews. "Well, Moss Brothers down to Haley has got a contract to put up a house for Thompson, out on the ranch, and they're coming back here to live. Maybe we'll board some of the workers." "What's that? When are they coming? Soon?" "Oh, I don't know. Sometime, I guess. They'll probably have a big one, with blinds and cupolas and marble chimneys onto it. And they'll most likely have gorgeous furnishings inside. Cuckoo clocks and music boxes and Brussels carpets. Some of them carpets that got bristles that long," he added, indicating about 18 inches. It was the second Christmas Eve. Number 1 seemed to wheeze and grumble to itself at having to stop at a place like Granite long enough to let 3 people off. But there they were on the platform, and Andrews welcomed them. "Whittaker won't be along till about 9, he said. "It's a bad night for the horses, and the train was an hour late at 3. "Mother has a bad headache. May she lie down in your room until John comes?" It was Martha. Her hand was white now, but as firm of clasp as ever. Her face was paler, but her eyes were the same. The most striking change was in her waist. Its lines had been emphasized by a cunning artificer in dress, and some latent curves had been developed. She said she was glad to see him again, and went to rub her mother's head with camphor. "You haven't got an extra pipe, have you, Andrews?" Thompson asked. He was quickly supplied with one, which he filled and smoked eagerly. "That's real smoke," he said, "and you can't get it out of cigars either. Well, I'm glad to get back to God's country again, back where you can see 100 miles, and get all the clean air you want to breathe and don't have to dodge shiny carriages. No more travel for me, my boy. Of course, I couldn't get out of it at first. You know how the women folks pester a man, but they'll be contented here now. We've been all over Chicago and London and Italy and Paris, as they call it. They're too small and crowded and slow, too. They don't get to dinner till supper time, and when they bring you a little dab at a time, table d'hote, that is, I didn't stand it long. I'd just have 'em bring me a good porterhouse steak with plenty of fat on it, and some fried potatoes and a piece of pie. A man wants to see just what he gets to eat, and not have a lot of fricasseed truck run in on him after he thinks he's down to cases. They don't know how to use money either. Why, in New York, they give you pennies and change, and when you get a bill changed, think they give you good hard silver dollars that you can feel? Not much. They lay out a lot of greasy $1 bills. I got 15 or 16 of the miserable little things in my pockets this minute. And, Hugh, it was Martha's voice, calling him from the doorway. He had thought her pale at first. Now 2 bright spots of color glowed on her cheeks, and her eyes were unnaturally bright. He stepped quickly into the little room. She closed the door and stood with her back against it, facing him with a look of accusation. He saw that her mother was asleep on his bed. She spoke in low but excited tones, and it seemed to him she was making an effort to keep from laughing, or crying, was it? Hugh, you're not a fit man to be in a position of trust. You've been false to my best friend, and I'm going to do something about it. I think I ought to write to the government. She had held one hand behind her. She put it forward now, and in it was that old letter he had written to her. I was looking through your scrapbook, and I found it, and I read it. Through a glare of light he saw the 2 unfolded sheets. He made a quick step forward and grasped the hand that held them. It was that night 2 years ago, Martha, and just after I'd written it, the message came about the mine. I was afraid to send it then. It wouldn't have looked well, and your father said so much about your meeting the right sort of people. You were a coward, you. There was scorn and something else in her glance that seemed to draw all the nerves in his body to the hand that grasped hers. You didn't dare send it, and you forgot me in a little while. And I wanted that letter. No, Martha, I never forgot. Never for a day nor an hour. I love you for always, Martha. The old lady on the bed stirred uneasily and opened her eyes. She closed them lazily again, though as if she had expected something of the sort. Thompson père opened the door and heard his daughter say, "That's American, isn't it?" "What's American?" he demanded. Martha submitted to that again for his general enlightenment. He grasped Hugh's hand. "Young man, you're all right." The words were not much, but men are creatures of the flesh. Most of them can say more in a handshake than in an oration. The dispatcher on duty at Cheyenne that night said, "Must be a new man on at GN. He's a bird on the key, I'll tell you." End of Section 5. End of The Black Cat, Volume 4, Number 3, December 1898.